Here is a question that sounds simple, but turns out to be surprisingly complicated. What does heaven look like? Ask most people shaped by Western Christian culture, and you will probably get something abstract. Light, peace, the presence of God, maybe clouds and harps if they're being a little ironic. Ask someone drawing on the Quran, and you get something that sounds almost shockingly different. Gardens watered by flowing springs, brocade couches, paired fruits hanging within reach, and companions described as fair corals and rubies. The Quran does not apologize for any of this. Surah 55, Surah Al-Rahman, hammers the point home with a refrain that repeats after every image it paints. Quote, "Which of your Lord's blessings would you deny?" End quote. For many Western observers, both medieval and modern, that vision of paradise has been a source of deep discomfort. It has fueled centuries of polemic. It still circulates in online arguments between Christians and Muslims, and it shapes how each tradition imagines the other. The standard move is to draw a straight line. Christianity is spiritual. Islam is material. Christianity promotes the vision of God. Islam promotes a garden with beautiful companions. One is elevated. The other is sensual. One is for the soul. The other is for the body. But that line is not straight, and it is not even particularly old. And the story of how it got drawn and why it persists takes us through one of the most underappreciated fault lines in the history of world religion. The difference not between Christianity and Islam, but between the many Christianities that existed and still exist across very different times and places. Today, we are going to look at 3 texts from 3 very different worlds. The first is a set of hymns written by a Syrian monk named Ephraim, who died in 373, and whose imagination of paradise shares far more with the Quran than most people realize. The second is the Quran itself, whose paradise we will read on its own terms rather than through the lens of polemic. The third is the Summa Theologiae of Thomas Aquinas, the towering systematic theologian of medieval Latin Christianity, whose account of happiness in heaven is almost perfectly antithetical to both Ephraim and the Quran. And along the way, we will look at how medieval Latin polemicists, tracked by the scholar Norman Daniel, weaponize the contrasts in ways that have never really gone away. The argument is this: what looks like a timeless clash between Christianity and Islam is really a story about one particular stream of Christianity, the Latin scholastic tradition, encountering Islam and deciding that the difference in their views of paradise proved Islam was false. But a Christian reading in Syriac in the 7th century, steeped in the same late antique world that shaped the Quran, would not have experienced that difference in nearly the same way. The shock, in other words, is not universal. It is historical, and understanding where it came from is the first step towards thinking about it more clearly. We began in 4th century Syria with a figure who is one of the most important Christian theologians most Western Christians have never heard of. Ephraim of Nisibis, who died in 373, wrote in Syriac, the dialect of Aramaic that was the everyday language of Christians across Mesopotamia, Syria, and Persia. He was a prolific poet, a composer of hymns, and a theologian who thought almost entirely in images rather than in propositions. His hymns on paradise are among the great works of early Christian literature, and they describe paradise in terms that will be immediately recognizable to anyone who has read Surah 55. In hymn 6, Ephraim describes what happens when Scripture leads the mind towards paradise. Quote, "Paradise surrounds the limbs with its many delights, the eyes with its handiwork, the hearing with its sounds, the mouth and the nostrils with its tastes and scents." End quote. This is a fully sensory paradise. Eyes, ears, mouth, nostrils, every faculty of the body is engaged. Ephraim is not embarrassed by this. He continues in the same hymn, quote, "Paradise raised me up as I perceived it. It enriched me as I meditated upon it. I forgot my poor estate, for it had made me drunk with its fragrance." Drunk with fragrance. This is not the language of abstract intellectual contemplation. This is the language of a body overwhelmed by beauty. In hymn 6, Ephraim develops the image further. The righteous in paradise are described as wearing garments of light, and paradise itself is a place of rest after earthly suffering. But the key stanza for our purposes describes the approach to paradise itself. Even from outside, the place exudes something. Quote, "Its dew will wash off your squalor, while what it exudes will render you fragrant. Its support will afford rest after your toil. Its crown will give you comfort. It will proffer you fruits in your hunger, fruits that purify those who partake of them. In your thirst, it will provide for you a celestial draught, one that makes wise those who drink of it." Dew, fragrance, fruit, drink. The paradise Ephraim imagines is one in which the body is comforted and restored. The soul does not escape the body to reach God. The body is transformed and brought along into a garden that actively nourishes it. Ephraim also describes paradise as a mountain with levels, the repentant on the lower slopes, the righteous in the middle, the victorious near the summit, with God's presence at the top. This is not so different from what Dante would later construct in the Paradiso, but it is also structurally similar to the idea of degrees in paradise, a concept the Quran references in Surah 4, verse 95, and Surah 17, verse 21. The idea of a graduated afterlife is not uniquely Islamic. It was deeply rooted in the late antique Eastern Christian world. What is Ephraim's paradise at its core? It is a restored garden. It is Eden reclaimed. The transgression of Adam and Eve closed off access to a place of sensory abundance, and the resurrection reopens it for the redeemed. The tree of life, the flowing springs, the fragrance, the fruits, all of this was always there, waiting. This is a profoundly Jewish and Semitic imaginary, one rooted in Genesis and cultivated across centuries of Syriac and Jewish apocalyptic literature. Now hold that image in your mind and turn to the Quran. John Toland, in his book Saracens, identifies an asymmetry worth noting here. Both Christianity and Islam affirm bodily resurrection, and for both traditions, the punishments of hell are physical. But the Quran, unlike most Christian texts, lavishes far more description on the joys of heaven than on the torments of hell. And they are joys that, as Toland puts it, quote, "aesthetically minded Christians would dare not hope for in the hereafter." End quote. The phrase aesthetically minded Christians is the key. Toland is not saying all Christians. He's pointing to a specific tradition, the monastic and the aesthetic tradition that became dominant in Latin Christianity, for whom the very abundance of Quranic paradise was a theological problem. The Quran's paradise is not a problem for all Christians in all times. It is a problem for a particular kind of Christian shaped by a particular kind of theology. Surah 55 is the most sustained and rhythmically powerful Quranic account of that paradise. The passage described 2 gardens, each watered by flowing springs, each bearing every kind of fruit in pairs. The faithful recline on couches lined with thick brocade, within reach of the garden's fruits. They dwell with companions, the Hur al-Ain, described as fair as corals and rubies, untouched by any before them. The refrain returns again and again. Which of your Lord's blessings would you deny? The word Jannah, the Arabic word for paradise, simply means garden, and the name captures the essence of what the passage describes. A restored Eden, a place of abundance and rest and beauty. This is not an accident. Islam emerged in the 7th century in a world saturated with Syriac Christianity. Jack Tannous, in his book, The Making of the Medieval Middle East, has shown in exhaustive detail how deeply Christianized the Near Eastern world was on the eve of Islam's appearance, and how many ordinary people in that world would have had direct, daily contact with Christian practice, Christian story, and Christian imagination. The first Muslims did not encounter the idea of a garden paradise as something alien. They encountered it as a part of the shared symbolic world of that region. Western Christians today often do not think much about stratification in the afterlife, even though it is present in Paul's letters. He described someone being, quote, caught up to the third heaven, end quote, in 2 Corinthians chapter 12, verse 2. And medieval Latin theology certainly had its own hierarchies, as Dante's Commedia demonstrates. Islam had its own tradition of multiple levels in both paradise and hell, and the Quran referenced degrees of reward based on one's deeds. This is another point of structural similarity between the Eastern Christian and Islamic traditions that tends to get lost when the comparison is filtered entirely through the 21st century Latin West. Now we move from 4th century Syria and 7th century Arabia to 13th century Paris, and the intellectual universe could not be more different. Imagine being told that no meal, no matter how good, could ever truly satisfy you. That hunger itself points towards something no food can provide. That is roughly the structure of Aquinas' argument about happiness. Every created good, however beautiful, is only a participation in goodness, not goodness itself. And the will that seeks goodness itself will never rest until it reaches the source directly. Thomas Aquinas wrote the Summa Theologiae between approximately 1265 and 1273. It is the most systematic and comprehensive statement of Latin scholastic theology ever produced, and its influence on how Western Christianity thinks about God, human nature, and the afterlife is nearly impossible to overstate. When modern Western Christians, Catholic or Protestant, have intuitions about what heaven is supposed to be, those intuitions have almost always been shaped directly or indirectly by the conceptual framework Aquinas constructed. Aquinas' account on human happiness, which is his account of what heaven consists in, is built on an Aristotelian foundation. In the Summa, he poses the question of whether any created good can constitute human happiness, and his answer is an unambiguous no. The argument is as follows: happiness is the perfect good, the kind that completely satisfies the will, and leaves nothing remaining to be desired. The object of the human will is the universal good, not this or that good thing, but goodness as such. That universal good cannot be found in any creature, because every creature has goodness only by participation. It does not possess goodness in itself. Therefore, quote, God alone constitutes man's happiness, end quote. The consequence for the afterlife is drawn out where Aquinas addresses what perfect happiness actually consists in. His answer is the visio divinae essentiae, the vision of the divine essence. Quote, final and perfect happiness can consist in nothing else than the vision of the divine essence. The argument proceeds through Aristotle's account of the intellect. The intellect reaches its perfection when it knows the essence of a thing, not merely its effects. We can know from the created world that God exists, but we cannot, from creation, know what God is. That desire to know the essence of the cause remains unsatisfied so long as we only know the effects. Only in the beatific vision, the direct intellectual apprehension of God's essence, is that desire finally stilled. Notice what has happened here. The body is not absent from Aquinas' account of the resurrection. After he died, his companions discussed the glorified body in the supplement to the Summa, but it plays no constitutive role in the happiness of heaven. The body in glory is ordered entirely towards the intellectual vision. What makes heaven is not fragrance, or fruit, or rest, or beauty, of any sensory kind. It is pure intellectual contemplation of God. Every creature, every garden, every pleasure falls away as a mere participation in goodness, incapable of satisfying the will that seeks the universal good itself. The contrast with both Ephraim and the Quran is stark. Ephraim writes of being, quote, drunk with fragrance, end quote, and of the body's limbs being, quote, surrounded with delight, end quote. The Quran places the righteous on brocade couches within reach of fruit. Aquinas says that no created good, and fruits, couches, and fragrances are all created goods, can constitute happiness. They are, at best, incidental accompaniments to the one thing that matters, which is the intellectual vision of God. It would be a mistake to think Aquinas was simply cold or unimaginative. His point is theological and philosophical, not a rejection of the body as evil, but the intellectual architecture he built, shaped by Aristotelian metaphysics and filtered through Neoplatonic traditions that shaped Latin theology, produced a heaven that is essentially intellectual, essentially spiritual, and essentially non-sensory. And that heaven became the standard by which Latin Christianity evaluated all other visions of the afterlife, including Islam's. This is where Norman Daniel enters the picture. His 1960 book, Islam in the West, The Making of an Image, is the definitive study of how medieval Latin writers constructed their image of Islam, and it is indispensable for understanding how the contrast between Christian and Islamic paradise became a polemical weapon. Daniel shows that for medieval Latin writers, the materiality of Quranic paradise was not simply a theological disagreement. It was evidence that Muhammad was a false prophet. The reasoning worked as follows. A true prophet must be holy, must be free from passion and carnality, and must lead his people towards spiritual, rather than material goods. Muhammad, in the Latin view, failed on all three counts. He was married multiple times. He exercised political and military power, and critically, he promised his followers a paradise of sensory pleasure rather than the vision of the divine essence. As Daniel puts it, it was a, quote, favorite theme of Lul's that Islam failed to teach the enjoyment of the divine essence in paradise. Then he quotes Ramon Lull, quote, and thus it is impossible that he who excites his people to sensual things rather than to spiritual ones should be a true messenger of God. End quote. Ramon Lull was a 13th century Catalan philosopher and missionary, one of the most sophisticated and informed Latin thinkers about Islam of his era. He actually knew enough about Islamic theology to understand that many Muslim thinkers interpreted the paradise descriptions allegorically or spiritually. He acknowledged that some Muslims, who read paradise as spiritual, quote, did not observe the Quranic law in other respects either, unquote. He was aware of the internal Islamic debate, and yet the polemic remained useful precisely because it could be aimed at what he took to be orthodox literal interpretation. The connection to prophethood is essential and tends to get lost in modern discussions. For medieval Latin writers, the materiality of Islamic paradise and the sexuality of Muhammad's personal life were not two separate complaints. They were two aspects of a single argument. A prophet who promised carnal rewards in the next life was of a piece with a prophet who pursued carnal pleasures in this one. Daniel documents how the scholastic criteria for true prophecy, drawn largely from Aquinas, was applied point by point to Muhammad as a negative checklist. Passions are incompatible with prophecy, therefore Muhammad's marriages disqualified him. Miracles confirm prophecy, therefore Muhammad's lack of miracles disqualified him. A true prophet leads people to spiritual goods, therefore Islamic paradise disqualified him. This is the polemical architecture that was constructed in the 13th and 14th centuries, and it has never really been dismantled. Its modern descendants are everywhere. The obsession in certain Christian apologetic circles with the marriage to Aisha, the mockery of the Hur al-Ain as a sex paradise, the implication that any religion which does not subordinate the body entirely to the soul must be primitive or licentious. These are not timeless Christian reactions. They are inherited arguments, shaped by a specific philosophical tradition, deployed in a specific historical context, and transmitted to the present with their polemical edge intact, but their historical origins forgotten. Here is what the comparison of Ephraim, the Quran, and Aquinas actually shows. A Syrian Christian of the late antique world, steeped in Ephraim's hymnic theology and the shared imaginative grammar of the Semitic East, would have found the Quranic garden paradise familiar in its basic structure, not identical. Ephraim's theology is Christocentric in ways the Quran is not, and the differences are very real. But the sensory richness, the levels of dwelling, the restored garden, the fragrance and fruit and light, none of this would have seemed alien. It was drawing from the same well. A Latin scholastic of the 13th century, shaped by Aristotelian metaphysics, and committed to the beatific vision as the sole content of human happiness, would have found the Quranic garden not merely different, but philosophically incoherent. If no created good can constitute happiness, then a paradise of created goods is not paradise at all. It's a gilded trap. What looks like a universal Christian intuition turns out, on inspection, to be a historically specific one. The discomfort with Quranic paradise was exported globally through the dominance of Latin Christian culture in the modern West, and it is experienced today by people who may have no formal theological commitments at all, but who have inherited the basic assumption that a spiritual afterlife is superior to a physical one. This does not mean that there are no genuine differences between Christian and Islamic accounts of the afterlife. There really are, and they are theologically significant in the internal diversity within both traditions. Sufi interpretations of paradise, Eastern Orthodox theosis, the wide variety of Islamic eschatological literature, the Protestant rejection of purgatory, means that any simple comparison will be oversimplification. There is no pope in Islam, no single authority whose pronouncements settle questions of this kind. There is not even a single Christian position, as the differences between Ephraim, Augustine, Aquinas, and a 20th century evangelical make clear. But what a historical approach does is recover the complexity that polemic always flattens. Ephraim's paradise and the Quran's garden are not the same thing, but they are cousins. They grew up from the same late antique soil and the same Semitic landscape, nourished by the same biblical imagery of Eden as the original home of divine abundance. The shock of Islamic paradise, then, is not a Christian reaction. It is a Latin scholastic one, and knowing that should change how you hear the argument the next time someone makes it.